Luca Conti had just stepped onto the marble steps of the penthouse when his phone buzzed for the third time in as many minutes. He ignored it, adjusting the cuff of his bespoke suit jacket with the kind of precision that came from years of practice. The kind of precision that kept men like him alive in a city where trust was a currency that went bankrupt faster than anyone could spend it. The morning light cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the building's entrance, catching the silver watch on his left wrist. His father's watch, the one he wore every morning without thinking, the same way other men wore their skin. The Omega who had given it to him on his 18th birthday had been dead for 22 years, but Lucas still felt the weight of it like a hand on his shoulder. His driver, Enzo, was supposed to be waiting at the black sedan by the gate. The council of the family, the consiglio, would be seated at the long walnut table in exactly 41 minutes. Luca did not have time for whispers. The scent hit him before the voice did. It was faint, barely there beneath the layers of expensive cologne and city exhaust, but Luca's alpha instincts caught it immediately. Vanilla, and something darker beneath it, like rain on dry earth. It was the scent of an Omega, and it was laced with fear. He turned. The young man standing at the mouth of the servants' passage was new. 2 months in the house, if Luca remembered correctly. 24 years old. Quiet. Always polite when he passed Luca in the corridor, always looking at the floor with those impossibly long lashes. Now he was pale, his hands trembling at his sides, his dark curls plastered to his forehead with sweat. Signor Conti. The Omega's voice was barely a whisper. Please, stay quiet. Follow me. Luca stopped, but he did not soften his voice. He had built an empire on the strength of his presence, on the weight of his words, on the primal authority that came with being an alpha who had never once been challenged in 20 years of ruling the city's underworld. I am late. What is this? The Omega stepped closer, and Luca caught the full force of his scent. It was intoxicating, a dangerous thing for an alpha to admit, even to himself. The young man's hand closed around the sleeve of Luca's suit jacket, and the grip surprised him. It was not the grip of a servant. It was the grip of someone who had made a decision and would not be swayed. 2 minutes. The Omega's eyes met his for the first time. Hazel, rimmed with gold, bright with desperate courage. If I am wrong, punish me. If I am right, you live. Luca looked down at the hand on his sleeve. He could have shaken it off with a single motion. He could have called for security, had this boy dragged away for his impertinence. He did neither. Something in the way the Omega said the word live, not survive, not escape, but live, made him stand still for exactly the length of one breath. That breath cost the Omega nothing and gave him everything. He pulled Luca sideways off the stone steps, behind the low decorative wall that ran along the base of the gatehouse column. Luca crouched beside him, the fabric of his suit brushing against old moss, his alpha instincts screaming at him to stand, to fight, to dominate. He silenced them. For now, from behind the wall, he could see the sedan waiting at the open gate. He could see the driver standing beside the rear door, and he began slowly to notice things. The driver was not Enzo. Enzo was 52, tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that had watched Luca grow from a boy into a man. This man was shorter, younger. His jaw was tight. His eyes moved once toward the front door, then away, then back again. The eyes of someone waiting for something to happen. Luca looked at the driver's coat. It was cut correctly, but the left hip was wrong. There was a bulge there, small, deliberate. The exact bulge of a holster worn beneath tailored wool. And the engine of the sedan was silent. That was the third thing. Enzo had one habit that had never changed in 15 years. He kept the engine running from the moment Luca's shoes touched the top step until the moment the rear door closed. Luca had complained about the fuel waste once, years ago. Enzo had simply replied that a warm engine was a fast engine, and one day his boss might need to leave a place quickly. The engine had never been off before. Not once. Luca's phone buzzed in his hand. He looked down. Matteo. He answered on the second ring, keeping his voice exactly where it had always been. My love. Matteo's voice came through the speaker, warm as honey poured into silver. The car is waiting. The meeting is important. Don't be late. Luca turned his eyes to the Omega crouched beside him. The young man shook his head once, slow, deliberate, final. Luca Conti had walked out of that front door thousands of times. This was the first time he had ever hidden from it. He ended the call, and the small light on the phone screen went dark. For 3 seconds, neither of them moved. The morning air behind the wall was still. A bird called from somewhere in the roses, unaware. The Omega reached into the pocket of his apron with a hand that was still shaking, and he pulled out a phone. It was old, the kind of phone Luca had not held in a decade. The screen was cracked across the corner like a broken window pane, and the case was held together at the edge with a strip of clear tape. Senior Conti, the Omega whispered. Yesterday morning, I was cleaning the West Wing. The library door was open. I did not know anyone was inside. I heard voices. He paused, his eyes moving to Luca's face and then away, as if he were preparing to say something he had rehearsed in silence for a full day. Senior Matteo was inside with Senior Damien. Luca did not move. He did not blink. He did not breathe. Damien Ricci was 33 years old. Luca had found him when the boy was 25, working in a small accounting office 3 streets from the port, hungry and clever and quiet. Luca had brought him inside the family, taught him, promoted him, given him the seat that his own father had once given to Marco Vitali. For 8 years, they had built together. Luca had trusted him the way a man trusts his own left hand. He had called him brother. The Omega's thumb pressed the screen. A small, tinny sound came from the speaker, and then a voice filled the silence behind the wall. It was Damien's voice. Calm. Measured. The voice of a man reading numbers from a ledger. The consiglio meeting is the moment. Enzo will not be there. My man drives. He goes into the tunnel and never comes out. A pause. You inherit as the grieving fiancé. I take the seat as advisor and regent. 6 months from now we marry. The empire is ours. And then Matteo's voice. The same voice that had set Luca's name across breakfast tables for 5 years. Now it was softer, warmer, private. It carried the sound of a smile. He never suspects because he trusts you. 5 years of trust. That is the beauty of it. The recording clicked off. Luca Conti did not react the way violent men reacted in films. He did not shake. He did not shout. He did not curse the name of his god. He simply became very, very still, the way water becomes still in a deep well before something drops into it. The silver watch on his wrist ticked once against the stone. He heard it. The Omega whispered, there is more. But we do not have time here. Please, come with me. The phone in Luca's other hand vibrated again. He looked down at the screen. Damien. He answered, his voice, when it came out. The voice of a man who had one appointment to keep and no worries in the world. Boss, everything is set. Enzo called in sick this morning. The replacement is trusted. Move. Luca let a breath out through his nose. Slow. Controlled. Exactly as he would have on any other Tuesday. On my way. He ended the call. The screen went dark for the second time. He looked at the Omega, really looked at him. He took in the dark curls, the hazel eyes with their rings of gold, the elegant line of his throat where Luca could see his pulse fluttering like a trapped bird. He smelled the fear still clinging to the young man's skin, but beneath it, something else. Something that made Luca's alpha instincts stir with an unfamiliar ache. What is your name? Luca asked quietly. The Omega blinked, startled by the question. Matteo. Matteo Rossi. Luca's jaw tightened. The same name as his treacherous fiancée. The irony was not lost on him. Show me what you have, Matteo Rossi. Every word. Matteo nodded once, his curls bobbing with emotion. 2 minutes ago, Luca Conti had been the most powerful alpha in the city. Now he was a man crouched behind a wall, holding a cracked phone in an Omega's trembling hand. And it was the only thing keeping him alive. Matteo slipped the cracked phone back into his apron and gestured with his head, not toward the front of the house, but toward the servant's door on the side wall, half hidden behind ivy. This way, Signor. Quietly. There is something else you should see. Luca followed him. He did not ask where. He did not speak at all. He moved the way a man moves in a house he no longer recognizes, though he had walked these floors every day for 18 years. His alpha senses were on high alert, cataloging every sound, every scent, every shift in the air. They passed through the low door and into the corridor that belonged to the staff. The corridor was narrow and cool, the walls plain plaster, the floor worn smooth by generations of feet that had never sat at his table. They passed through the back of the kitchen. The cook did not look up. She had learned long ago never to look up when the padrone walked through her domain. Today, without knowing why, that habit was the mercy that saved her. Mateo led him up a narrow servant staircase, along another corridor, and then to a small stone balcony on the second floor. It was a balcony almost no one used. It faced inward toward the private rose courtyard where Mateo liked to read his books in the early morning. Mateo stopped one step before the railing. He did not step out. He waited. Lucas stepped forward. Below him, in the sunlight, Mateo Conti stood beside the fountain. He was wearing the pale linen shirt he had worn 100 times, his dark hair gathered loosely at his neck, his beta scent, neutral, unassuming, rising faintly in the morning air. And standing very close to him, close enough that a stranger would have understood without a word, was Damien Ricci. They were not embracing. That would have been easier to bear. It would have been an act of passion, a single mistake, something an alpha could tell himself was heat and not habit. This was worse. This was ordinary. Damien rested his hand on the curve of Mateo's hip the way a husband does after 20 years. Mateo lifted his hand, not to push him away, but to adjust the collar of his shirt. His fingers moved with the ease of someone who had done this small task hundreds of times, in hundreds of quiet mornings, in a house that was not his. After today, Damien said softly, we do not have to hide anymore. Mateo tilted his head back to look at him. He smiled. It was not a smile Luca had ever seen on his face. I hate waiting. But I have waited well. For 5 years, I have played the future alpha of the Conti house. I want the title to be real. He lifted his left hand toward the sunlight. The ring Luca had placed on his finger 1 year ago, a simple gold band, traditional, unassuming, caught the light and threw a small, cruel arc onto the stone of the fountain. Mateo turned the ring on his finger slowly, and he laughed low and private. This will look better on my hand when he is dead. Damien leaned forward and pressed his lips lightly to Mateo's forehead. Then they moved apart, walking in different directions across the courtyard, the way two people leave a room they own together. On the balcony above them, Luca Conti did not move. He did not breathe. His right hand rested on the stone railing, and slowly, without his permission, the knuckles turned white. Beside him, Matteo Rossi said nothing. He understood that this was not a moment for words. There is a particular silence that follows the moment a man discovers that the person he loved most has been the one holding the knife. It is not the silence of grief. It is the silence of a life ending in one place and beginning coldly in another. After a long moment, Luca turned his head toward Matteo. Who is with you at home? He asked. Who will come looking for you if I keep you here? Matteo hesitated. His fingers tightened around the edge of his apron. Only my little brother, Senior. Enzo. He is 6 years old. Luca nodded slowly. An Omega caring for a child on his own. No parents mentioned. No pact to speak of. The pieces clicked into place. The cracked phone, the trembling hands, the desperate courage that had driven this young man to risk everything for a stranger. He would need to protect 2 people now, and he had less than an hour to become someone dangerous enough to do it. Luca turned away from the balcony without looking at the courtyard again. Some things you did not need to look at twice. He gestured for Matteo to follow, and the Omega did. They went back down the servant's stair, but this time Luca led. Past the kitchen, past the pantry, past the small door most of the household had never noticed at the end of a side corridor. The door that looked like a wine cellar and was not. Luca pressed his palm against a panel of dark wood. Something clicked deep inside the wall. The door opened onto a narrow staircase that descended into the basement below the penthouse. The room at the bottom was small, bare stone walls, a wooden desk, a single lamp, a steel safe built into the wall. There were no windows, no cameras, no listening devices. Because the old alpha who had trained Luca, Marco Vitali, still drove into the city once every week and swept every corner with his own hands. It was the only room in the estate that belonged only to Luca. He closed the door behind them and locked it. Sit. Matteo sat. He placed his cracked phone in the center of the desk with both hands, the way one places something valuable and fragile. Then he pressed play. There were 11 minutes of recording. Luca did not interrupt any of them. He heard Damien lay out the plan in the calm voice of an accountant reading numbers. The Eastern Tunnel, the camera marked for repair for a month. The car stopped at the midpoint. Luca removed and taken to an abandoned paper mill on the north edge of the industrial district. He would not be killed immediately. He would be kept for several days, long enough to break him, long enough to force his signature on the transfer of the Swiss accounts, the properties in Monaco, the shares held under 3 shell names in Luxembourg. Matteo's voice came through the small speaker. And after? After is an accident. The car goes off the coast road into the bay, Damien said. The body is never recovered. You grieve. You inherit. 6 months from now, you choose me as advisor and adjust the family's leadership. 1 year from now, we marry. No one suspects. Grief is patient. So is greed. Why not just kill him at once? Matteo asked. There was no tremor in his voice, only curiosity. It would be cleaner. Because if he dies in this house, the police come and they open the walls. If he vanishes on the road, the men on the street believe it was a rival family. And we mourn loudly, and we swear revenge on empty rooms. The story writes itself. The story protects us. There was a small silence on the tape. Then Matteo spoke again, and this time the smile came through in his voice. 5 years. He gave me houses and diamonds. But he never gave me the seat. I sat next to power. I never held it. That ends this week. The recording clicked off. Luca stood up from the desk. He did not speak. He walked to the safe in the wall, entered a code Matteo did not see, and opened it. He took out 2 things. The first was an old service pistol, the steel dark, the grip worn smooth. His father's gun. He had not held it in 10 years, since the day he had buried the old Alpha with a rosary in one pocket and a folded flag in the other. The second was a satellite phone. He turned to Matteo. You heard all of it. Do you understand what this means for you? Matteo met his eyes. His voice, when it came, was steadier than his hands. It means if I go home tonight, they will find me, and Enzo will be alone. Luca looked at him for a long moment. The Omega's scent was stronger now, the vanilla and rain, and Luca realized with a start that it was affecting him in ways he had not anticipated. His alpha instincts, honed over decades of ruthless control, were stirring with something unfamiliar, something that felt dangerously like protection. That will not happen, he said. Not while I breathe. He picked up the satellite phone. There was one alpha in this world he still trusted, and that man had not answered a call in 18 months. Luca dialed a number he had not dialed in 18 months. It rang 3 times. On the 4th, an old voice answered, calm and slow, the voice of a man who had been expecting this call for years and had not decided whether to be relieved or sorry. Luca. A pause. Marco. That was all. The old soldier did not ask what had happened. He did not need to. In the family of the Connie, only one kind of phone call came from the basement office at 9 o'clock in the morning. I am coming, Marco Vitali said. 3 hours. The line went dead. Luca set the satellite phone down. Matteo was watching him the way a person watches a doctor after a diagnosis, waiting to be told what to do next. Luca gave him the next 3 hours of his life in a single breath. First, he made 3 calls on the house line. Each of them ordinary. Each of them a small blade slipped between ribs. He phoned the office of the consigliere and postponed the meeting by 2 days, citing a sudden fever. Damien would receive that news within 20 minutes, and he would not be able to object without revealing that he already knew Luca should never have reached that meeting alive. He phoned Enzo, his real driver, the one who had taught him to trust no one but himself, and told him one word in the old dialect, come. Enzo did not ask why. Enzo simply said yes and hung up. Now, Lucas said, turning back to Matteo. I need you to think slowly. In the last 3 months, what has Matteo changed? Small things. Things he would not tell me. Things a beta who is stopping loving and alpha stops pretending about. Matteo was quiet for a moment. Then he began. 3 weeks ago, Matteo had moved into the guest bedroom in the east wing, saying that Luca's cough kept him awake. Luca had not coughed at night in his life. He had taken down the photographs of their upcoming wedding from the drawing room one by one, week by week, and replaced them with old family portraits. When the housekeeper asked, he had said the light did not fall well on the newer frames. He had asked the cook to stop preparing seafood in the house. The smell, he said, made him nauseous. Luca loved seafood. He ate it 3 times a week. Luca listened without expression. Each small thing was a signal he had missed because he had been too busy being the alpha other alphas feared. A beta had stopped pretending to love him 3 months ago, in 100 small ways, in his own house, and he had not noticed a single one. Then he began to speak, more to himself than to Matteo. In the last 6 months, Damien has asked for quiet meetings with 3 of the family's captains. Lorenzo, the oldest. Vito, the ambitious one. Salvatore, the youngest and hungriest. Damien called them working lunches. I approved them without a second thought. I no longer know which of those 3 alphas still belong to me. The doorbell of the private stair rang. Luca opened it himself. Marco Vitali stood in the doorway, 68 years old, tall, his hair the color of iron and salt. He wore a simple wool sweater and a coat that had seen many winters. He stepped inside, and without a word wrapped his arms around Luca the way a father embraces a son he had believed was already lost. Then Marco stepped back, and his eyes went to Matteo. His nostrils flared slightly, catching the Omega's scent. Who is she? Luca looked at the young Omega at his desk, at the cracked phone in front of him, at the fear he was carrying without complaint. He is the reason I am still standing here, Luca said quietly. His name is Matteo Rossi. Marco studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded once and turned back to Luca, placing his hand on Luca's shoulder the way he had done when Luca was 14 years old and his father was newly buried. Your father used to say the enemy inside the house is worth 10 enemies in the street. We cannot fight Damien like an enemy. We have to let him believe he is winning. Somewhere in the West Wing, Damien Ricci was pouring himself an espresso and waiting for a phone call that would never come. Marco listened as Luca laid out the first hour of the plan in short, clean sentences, the way his father had once taught him. When Luca finished, Marco nodded once and stepped toward the door. There is one thing before you go, Luca said. Marco turned. He has a brother at home, 6 years old, alone in an apartment across the city. If Damien starts looking for the leak, that apartment is the first place he goes. Marco understood before the sentence was finished. Amalfi, he said. The house on the cliff. 3 hours by car. Quiet road. Take 2 of your own men. No one from this house, not even the cook, knows the child exists. Marco nodded and left to arrange the car. Luca closed the door of the basement office again. He sat down opposite Matteo at the desk, looked at him for a long moment, then spoke quietly. Tell me about him. Enzo. Matteo looked down at his hands. He kept his voice even. He had told this story before, on job applications, on hospital forms, but never like this. His parents had died in a car crash 5 years ago. A wet road at night. A truck that did not stop. Matteo had been 19. Enzo had been 1. Enzo had been born with a hole between the 2 chambers of his small heart. The doctors had said the surgery was simple, in another country, for a family who could pay. They were not that family. Matteo had worked 3 jobs at once for 5 years. He had cleaned houses in the morning, waited tables in a cafe through the afternoon, scrubbed floors in a lawyer's office through the night. He had slept in fragments. It had not been enough. Enzo had to take a small blue vial every 8 hours. If he missed a dose, his heart beat too fast, his lips turned the color of old bruises, and his breath went shallow. Matteo carried a spare vial in the pocket of every coat he owned. He had never gone out of the apartment without it. Not once in 5 years. 2 months ago, he had come to work in the Connie estate. The salary was 3 times what any other house paid. He had planned to stay 6 months, long enough to save for the surgery in Zurich. 6 months was the length of a promise he had made to his sleeping child. Luca listened without moving. When Matteo was finished, he asked a question he had not planned to ask. Why did you risk your life for me? You could have let me get in that car. You could have pretended you heard nothing. My problems were not your problems. Matteo was quiet for a long time. Then he looked up, and when he spoke, his voice was very steady. My father was a builder. He used to say that when you see something wrong, you can pretend you did not see, but then you carry it. And carrying it is heavier than fixing it. Signor Conti, I have carried enough already. Luca did not answer at once. He reached inside his jacket, took out a slim black bank card, and set it on the wood between them. The number is 55,555. Tomorrow, Enzo flies to Zurich. Dr. Weiss will operate. There is no debt. Matteo shook his head and started to push the card back across the desk. That is not a reward, Lucas said. That is the right thing. You did the right thing for me. I am doing the right thing for you. Matteo did not pick up the card. He stood up from the chair, and he looked at Luca with eyes that were tired but not lost. First we save you, Signor. Then we talk about Enzo. For the first time in 15 years, Luca Conti stood in the presence of someone who wanted nothing from him. And it felt more foreign than being betrayed. Luca walked back up the servant stair as if he had spent the morning approving invoices. At the top, he adjusted his cuffs, straightened the silver watch on his wrist, unlocked the small tightness in his jaw the way a man rehearses a smile before a photograph. Then he stepped through the door into the main house, and the padrone of the Conti family was, for anyone who saw him, exactly the same alpha he had been the day before. Matteo went back to his work. Marco had given him 3 instructions in the corridor. Wash the linens on the 2nd floor. Do not walk near the west wing. If Damien speaks to you, look at the floor and answer nothing longer than 3 words. He nodded once and disappeared into the household like a stone dropped into deep water. The rest of the day passed in the careful silence of a house that did not know it was already burning. At 8 in the evening, dinner was served in the small dining room, the one with the window that faced the private garden. Matteo came down in a dark silk shirt and the pearl cufflinks Luca had given him 3 years ago in Rome. He had drawn his eyes with the same soft line he always drew. He smiled at Luca from the doorway the way he had smiled at him on 1,000 nights. You are back early, he said. How was the day? Luca rose and pulled out his chair. He kissed the air beside his cheek. A habit, a ritual, a performance. The meeting was postponed. The council needs more preparation. Matteo sat down and lifted his wine glass. Luca caught the small movement in his brow. It was almost nothing, the trace of a frown he erased in the same second he wore it. Postponed, he repeated softly. You have not postponed a consiglio in 5 years. There is a first time for everything. Matteo studied him over the rim of his glass. You look tired, my love. Are you well? Luca looked back at him, and for the first time in many years, he saw him clearly. His eyes were not warm. His eyes were calculating the odds. He was measuring whether his plan had a crack, and how wide. Luca answered with the only sentence in the world he could not respond to. I was thinking about my father. Matteo's knife stopped in the air 1 heartbeat too long. Luca's father had died 22 years ago, killed on a street in Palermo by a car bomb placed there by his own advisor. It was a story Luca had never told him, and he had learned long ago never to ask. Now he set the knife down carefully and chose his voice with visible care. You rarely speak of him. Because there are things that do not need to be spoken, Luca said quietly. There are betrayals that are louder in silence. Matteo laughed, thin and quick. You are philosophical tonight. 2 floors below them, Marco Vitali sat in the basement office with the satellite phone against his ear. In the last 3 hours, he had spoken with 4 old contacts in 3 countries. They had confirmed what he had already suspected. In the last 90 days, €4 million had moved out of a Connie holding account into an anonymous account in a bank in Andorra. Enough to buy captains. Not all of them, but enough. 3 names, Lorenzo, Vito, Salvatore. Lorenzo was the oldest, the one Luca's own father had chosen. If any of the three could still be reached, it was Lorenzo. Upstairs, dinner ended. At the door of the dining room, Matteo leaned in and pressed his lips lightly to Luca's forehead, the way he had done every night for 5 years. Luca did not move. Matteo drew back slowly. "Are you all right, my love?" "Always," Luca said. Matteo left the room. Luca walked to the mirror in the hall and looked at the faint print of his lips on his skin. He wiped it clean with the back of his hand. He would have to kiss him back tomorrow and the day after, until the trap was ready. Because in this game, the alpha who could not act was the alpha who died first. 3 days passed inside the penthouse the way 3 days pass on a slow-burning fuse. Luca lived in 2 roles. In the daylight, he was a fiancé who kissed his future husband's temple, discussed spring travel, and complained politely about the weather. In the basement after midnight, he was a hunter arranging the pieces on a board no one else could see. On the first night, Lorenzo came, the oldest captain in the family, the one Luca's own father had chosen 30 years ago. Marco brought him in through the servant's door at 2 in the morning. Lorenzo was 60 years old, heavy in the shoulders, and he carried a leather bag with both hands like a man carrying something dead. He set the bag on the desk and opened it. It was full of banded euros. "Damien came to me 8 weeks ago," Lorenzo said. "He did not sit down. He put this on my kitchen table. He said I would take the advisor's seat when the transition happened. He did not name the transition. He did not need to." Lorenzo's eyes moved to Luca's face. "I took the money because if I had refused, he would have known. If he had known, I would have been dead the same week. But I never spent a coin. It belongs to you, Padrino. It always did." Luca looked at the leather bag for a long moment. "You are still your father's son," Marco said quietly to Lorenzo. He would be proud tonight. Over the next 2 days, the counter-move took shape. Lorenzo brought in 4 more captains, all alphas who had served the family since Luca's father was alive. Enzo returned in secret from Como and joined them in the basement. Vito and Salvatore, the 2 captains Damien had bought, were placed under quiet observation, their phones, their drivers, their women. The trap itself was simple. Luca would announce a very important consiglio at the old villa outside the city 3 mornings from now. He would ride in the same black sedan. He would leave at the same time. Damien's route through the eastern tunnel would be honored down to the meter. The alpha inside the sedan, however, would not be Luca Conti. It would be a retired officer of the Carabinieri, an alpha of similar height and shoulders, wearing Luca's suit. Luca and Lorenzo would follow in an armored SUV, 3 minutes behind, with 4 of Lorenzo's best. On the second afternoon, Marco drove Matteo south to the villa in Amalfi. The visit lasted 1 hour. When Matteo returned, his eyes were wet but calm, and he was carrying a small silver butterfly on a thin chain. "Enzo sent it," he said. "It keeps people safe." That evening in the basement office, Marco set up a laptop. Enzo appeared on the screen with a serious little face, dark blonde hair cut into a short bob, and a silver butterfly around his neck. He looked at Luca through the camera the way a scientist looks at a specimen. "My Omega said you are a good alpha," Enzo announced. Luca cleared his throat quietly. "He said that. He said you are quiet a lot, but your eyes are not cold. He said people whose eyes are not cold are usually good inside." Luca did not know how to answer. He had received compliments from senators, from cardinals, from a noble at a private dinner. None of them had ever cost him a single steady breath. This one did. Enzo tilted his head slightly. "Please keep my Omega safe. He is the only one I have." "I will," Luca said. He was surprised by how firm the words came out. "I promise." The screen went dark. Luca sat in the small pool of the desk lamp for a long time. When Matteo came back through the basement door that night, Luca stopped him before he reached the stairs. "Tomorrow, you stay down here for the whole meeting. Marco will watch you. You do not go anywhere alone. Do you understand?" Matteo nodded. "And Matteo," Luca added quietly, "if I do not come back, the number 55,555 is still good. You remember." Mateo's eyes widened. Senior Connie. Promise me. Mateo swallowed hard. I promise. At 8 in the morning, Luca Conti stepped out onto the same stone steps where an Omega had grabbed his sleeve 4 days earlier. He wore the same black suit, the same silver watch on his left wrist, the same phone in his right hand. From the front gate, it was the same morning. From the inside of the Alpha walking down those steps, it was another life entirely. He moved slower than usual. His eyes swept the driveway once, twice, without appearing to. The sedan was there. The false driver was there. The bulge under the coat was there. Mateo stood in the doorway behind him in a cream silk robe, holding a small cup of coffee like a man seeing his love off to an ordinary meeting. Come home for lunch, he said. Luca turned. He walked back up 2 steps. He placed his hand lightly on Mateo's hip and kissed him. The way an alpha kisses the beta he intends to spend the next 40 years beside. He tasted the coffee on his lips. Mateo smiled up at him. Luca did not know until that moment that he could act well enough to fool him. He was briefly disgusted with himself for it. Then the disgust was replaced by something colder, something useful. I will try. He walked down the steps. Damien was standing beside the car, wearing his gray Melton coat, his hair combed back. He looked exactly the way an advisor should look on a Tuesday morning. Luca almost admired the precision of the mask. The meeting begins at 9:30, Padrino. I know. The false driver opened the rear door. Luca paused, and for one heartbeat he looked at Damien and let him see nothing. Damien smiled the small, respectful smile of a younger brother. I have an errand at the port. I will join you at the villa by 10. Take your time, Luca said quietly. He got into the car. Inside the sedan, sitting in the leather where Luca had sat every morning for 4 years, was another alpha. His hair was the same gray shade. His shoulders were the same width under Luca's suit. He wore Luca's spare silver watch. He did not look at Luca, and Luca did not look at him. In the second before the door closed, they exchanged the smallest nod 2 soldiers ever exchange. The kind that means if this goes wrong, I will not blame you. Luca slipped out through the far door, low, and into the alley behind the gatehouse. The armored SUV was already waiting there with the engine warm. Lorenzo was at the wheel. 4 of his best sat in silence behind him. Luca climbed in beside Lorenzo, and the SUV began to move. The sedan rolled through the gate. Damien watched it go. Damien did not know that the alpha he had already killed in his head was 300 meters behind him, watching him back. 3 minutes later, the sedan entered the eastern tunnel. Halfway through, its brake lights flared. 2 black vans slid across the tunnel behind it. A third van appeared ahead, blocking the exit. 6 alphas in dark coats stepped out with rifles raised. The SUV came around the last curve and stopped hard. The doors opened before the wheels had settled. Luca was already moving. Lorenzo's men fanned out along the tunnel wall, using columns for cover. The gunfight was short. Concrete swallowed the shots and gave them back louder. 4 of the ambushers went down in the first 10 seconds. 2 threw their rifles onto the tunnel floor and raised their hands. The false driver crouched behind the sedan and did not fire at all. Luca walked to him through drifting smoke, pulled him up by the collar, and pressed the barrel of his father's pistol against the man's temple. Who paid you? The alpha was crying. Damien Ricci. Matteo Conti. €500,000. That is all I know. That is all. The satellite phone in Luca's coat pocket vibrated. He answered without lowering the pistol. Marco's voice came through tight. Padrino, Damien left the penthouse 2 minutes after your car. He never went to the port. Matteo is gone from his rooms. His passport case is empty. Luca stood in the smoke, listening to his own breath. They knew. He said quietly into the phone. Find them. Now. He had prepared a cage. He had forgotten that foxes can smell iron before they see it. Within an hour, Lorenzo's second team hit the western warehouse Damien had chosen as the holding site. It was the address in the recording, the one where Luca was supposed to have spent the last week of his life signing over accounts. The warehouse was empty. Not abandoned, empty. There was a difference, and it told the story on its own. Ropes lay coiled on the floor beside a metal chair. A small generator hummed against one wall. 2 mugs of coffee sat on a folding table, still faintly warm. A newspaper from that morning had been opened to the sports page and left face down. Damien and Mateo had walked out of that warehouse maybe 30 minutes before the door was kicked in. Back in the basement office of the penthouse, Marco arrived from the private garages with a file in his hand and a grim mouth. He set the file on the desk in front of Luca. 2 forged passports. Names of no importance. Both were prepared 11 months ago by a printer in Trieste we used ourselves in the 80s. There is 120,000 euros missing from a private cash safe in the West Wing. Mateo's safe, the one only he had the code to. Marco tapped the folder with 2 fingers. This was not a plan that failed today, Padrino. This was a plan B they built alongside it. If we found out, they vanished. They were always ready to vanish. Luca looked at the folder for a long moment. He had believed he was chasing a beast that had grown careless. He now understood he was chasing a beast that had grown patient. He assembled a small circle in the basement. Marco, Lorenzo, Enzo, 2 of the loyal captains from the previous days, and Matteo Rossi, who had been washing sheets on the 2nd floor when Marco quietly asked him to come down. He looked frightened when he entered the room. Luca spoke to him the way one speaks to a witness in a courtroom, not to an Omega. You have listened to the recording more times than any of us. In the middle, there was a line I did not catch. Damien spoke about a place they might use if the plan turned. A quiet place. Do you remember? Matteo closed his eyes for a moment. His lips moved silently. Then he opened his eyes. The old cabin at Bergamo, he said. He said if we need it. The old cabin at Bergamo. The one your father left me when I was a student. Marco's head lifted sharply. Your father gave Damien that cabin the year he graduated. 20 years ago. It was never on any list of family properties. It has always been in Damien's own name. Within 20 minutes, Marco had dispatched 2 teams, one north to the hills above Bergamo, one toward the Swiss border where Damien's known accounts were held. Roadblocks were arranged through the family's police contacts. Airports were watched. Somewhere south of the city, on a road that ran along the coast, a small silver car was moving too fast for its own good. Matteo Cani was in the passenger seat. His makeup was gone. His hair was pinned back with an ordinary clip. He looked 12 years older than he had looked at breakfast. Who told him? He said, his voice thin as glass under pressure. No one knew. No one. No one. Damien did not look at him. He kept his eyes on the road. Someone heard. Someone saw. We do not have many people in that house, Matteo. Think. Matteo thought. He thought about the corridor near the library. He thought about the sound of a bucket being set down softly at exactly the wrong moment. The new Omega, he said, his voice going flat. The Rossi boy. He was near the library that morning. Damien was quiet for a long time. He did not accelerate. He did not slow down. Then he spoke. We are not going to Bergamo. We stay in the city. We cannot run while he is everything. We have to make him bleed. Matteo turned his head slowly. What are you saying? Damien's hands tightened on the wheel. We take from him the one thing that makes him still a human being. We take the Rossi Omega. Somewhere in the city, Matteo Rossi was making a small cup of tea for himself in the penthouse's staff kitchen, not knowing that at that exact moment, 2 people had just turned him into a target. The silver car did not go to Bergamo. It did not turn toward the Swiss border. It rolled quietly into an old district of Naples where the streets were too narrow for surveillance vans, and the buildings watched each other with tired stone eyes. Damien parked in the courtyard of a 3-story building that had never appeared in any land register under his name. He had bought it years ago through a distant cousin for exactly this week. The apartment on the 2nd floor had 2 rooms, 1 window, and no camera on any wall of the courtyard. It was clean. It was ready. It had been waiting patiently. Damien locked the door behind them and set his briefcase on the small kitchen table. He worked for 1 hour on his phone without speaking. He read. He calculated. He made a list on a folded envelope in small, precise handwriting. Matteo Rossi, 24. No parents. A younger brother 6 years old. Congenital heart defect. Medication every 8 hours. The brother lives in an apartment on the third floor of a building in the Trastevere quarter. 2 windows, 1 door. One elderly neighbor who often watches the child. No cousins, no aunts, no boyfriend. No one else who would come looking. When Damien lifted his eyes, they were not the eyes of an alpha mourning a lost empire. They were the eyes of an alpha reading a road map to another one. If we take him, Damien said, he has to choose. He brings us 30 million euros in cash into a wired account, or we send him back in pieces. Either way, while he is choosing, we are on a boat leaving the coast. Matteo had been standing at the window. He turned slowly. And if he does not care about him enough? Damien looked at him the way a professor looks at a slow student he had once believed in. Matteo, have you seen how he looks at him? How he stood beside him in the corridor yesterday. He saved his life. Alphas like Luca do not forget that. He is his weakness now. His only one. Matteo turned back to the window. He was 31 years old. There was a fine dust in the air of the courtyard below, floating in the afternoon light. He looked at it for a long time and thought about 5 years. He thought about the first dinner when he was 26 and Luca was 31, and neither of them had money. He thought about every year he had asked quietly when they would marry, and the same soft answer Luca had always given him. Next year, when things settle. Nothing had ever settled. He had grown into his 30s beside a promise that never became a date. The simple gold band on his left hand had begun to feel like a receipt for a purchase that had never arrived. He did not regret what he had done. He was surprised to notice, standing at the courtyard window, that he was not enjoying it either. Behind him, Damien was on his phone. He was speaking with 2 alphas Luca had dismissed from the family the previous year. Alphas whose taste for violence had exceeded even Damien's tolerance. They still owed Damien favors. They still owed Damien silence. They agreed to meet inside the hour. The plan was simple. Matteo Rossi would have to leave the penthouse. He would not stay away from Enzo's medicine for long. When he came for his own clothes and the child's spare vial, they would move. 2 hours later, inside the penthouse, that exact conversation was taking place in a quieter voice. I cannot leave Enzo without his spare vial, Matteo Rossi was saying. He uses one every 8 hours. The one I have runs out tomorrow morning. 30 minutes, Signor. That is all. Marco will come with me. Luca did not want him to go. He said so twice. Matteo did not raise his voice. He simply repeated the same sentence about his brother's medicine until Luca understood that the Omega in front of him would walk out of the gate on his own feet if he tried to stop him. 2 cars, Luca said finally. Marco and 4 men. You are inside the apartment for less than 15 minutes. Do you hear me? I hear you. At 4 in the afternoon, Matteo Rossi stepped out of a black sedan in front of his own building. Marco stood in the lobby, coat open, hand resting on the grip inside it. 2 of his men stayed by the entrance. 2 more moved to the rear alley. Matteo climbed the stairs, 3 flights. He did not know that on the 4th floor above him, 3 alphas were waiting for the sound of his footsteps. He unlocked the door of his own apartment for the last time that day. The rooms were as he had left them 4 mornings ago. A cup of cold tea on the counter, a folded newspaper on the small kitchen table, the blue vial of Enzo's heart medicine on the top shelf of the cupboard, exactly where he always kept it. Enzo was asleep in the small bedroom. Beside his bed, in a low chair, sat old Rosa Bianchi from the apartment across the hall. Rosa was 70 years old, thin as winter wood, and had been minding Enzo every afternoon for 2 years. She lifted her eyes from her book and smiled. He has been good today. He ate the whole soup. Matteo moved fast. He opened the cupboard and took down the spare vial. He pulled Enzo's small suitcase from under the bed and packed clothes for a week, folding without thinking. He reached for the stuffed rabbit Enzo slept with every night, the medical booklet from the drawer, the small photograph of their parents. Rosa watched him for a long moment. Are you all right, child? You look afraid. Matteo opened his mouth to answer. He never got the chance. There was a sound in the corridor outside, not the sound of a neighbor coming home, not the sound of a knock. It was the sound of shoes moving quickly on a floor they did not want to be heard on. The door slammed inward off its hinges. 3 alphas in dark coats pushed through the doorway. One went for Rosa. The 2 others came for Mateo. He fought like an animal that had spent 5 years being told to be small and quiet. He scratched. He kicked. He screamed. He caught one alpha across the cheek with a nail and drew a line of blood before he could get his hand on his wrist. The other drove a fist into his stomach, and he folded. He struck him once across the face, and Mateo hit the floor. Enzo woke up crying. Mateo lifted his head from the wooden floor and saw Rosa pinned against the wall by an alpha twice her size. He saw Enzo sitting up in the little bed, small fists at his cheeks, mouth open in a soundless O of fear. And in that instant, Mateo's whole life narrowed to one sentence. Rosa. His voice tore out of his chest. Rosa, take Enzo. Take him away. Rosa understood in a heartbeat. When the alpha on her turned his head to look at Mateo on the floor, she drove her thin heel down into his shin as hard as her old body could manage. He grunted. She was already moving, already at the bed, scooping Enzo up under both arms and running for the small back door of the apartment, the one that opened onto the servants' corridor. The alpha swore and turned to follow. Mateo rolled onto his side and locked both hands around his ankle. He tripped and went down hard on one knee. It bought Rosa 10 seconds. 10 seconds was enough. Rosa was already through the door with Enzo pressed to her chest. The door of the apartment darkened. Damien Ricci stepped through. He looked down at Mateo on the floor without expression, took a folded white cloth from his coat, and pressed it hard over his mouth and nose. Mateo's eyes went to Enzo's empty bed, and then to nothing at all. Rosa reached the stairwell. She did not go up, she went down. She half ran, half fell 3 flights, Enzo in her arms. At the bottom, Marco Vitali was already moving toward the stairwell, phone against his ear, the shouts from above finally reaching him a half-second too late. He caught the old woman as she stumbled into the lobby. Rosa shoved Enzo into his arms. His Omega. Upstairs. Save his Omega. Marco spoke 2 words into his phone and started running. His men came behind him. But by the time they reached the 3rd floor, the door was open, the room was empty, and the sound of an engine was fading down the back alley. Marco kicked open the apartment door with his shoulder. The rooms were still. On the wooden floor by the bed lay Enzo's stuffed rabbit, one ear folded under. He came back down the stairs slowly. Enzo was standing beside Rosa in the lobby, his hand pressed hard against the silver butterfly on his necklace, his eyes enormous and dry. He looked up at Marco. Where is Mateo? Marco knelt down until his face was level with the child's. He kept his voice as steady as an old soldier could keep it. I'm going to bring him back. I promise. Marco Vitali had made 3 promises in his life. He had failed to keep them. This would not be the 4th. In the study on the 2nd floor of the penthouse, Luca was standing over a map of the city when the phone rang. He answered on the 1st ring. Padrino. Marco's voice was tight and low. They took him. There was a pause. Not the pause of an alpha not understanding, but the pause of an alpha refusing for 1 single second to accept a sentence he had already understood completely. Enzo is safe. Rosa got him out. Mateo. They took Mateo. Luca did not answer for 10 seconds. He simply stood there, the phone against his ear, staring at nothing. Then he moved. He walked to the tall walnut cabinet against the wall, pressed a hidden catch under the shelf, and opened the small steel safe behind the false panel. He took out his father's pistol. He checked the magazine. He pushed it back into the grip until it clicked. He slid the gun into the shoulder holster under his jacket the way a priest arranges a stole, without hurry, without noise. Then he lifted the phone again. Bring Enzo and Rosa to the Amalfi house now. 2 cars. 3 men each. Total protection. Enzo is not to be told exactly what happened. Tell him Mateo is away on an errand. Yes, Padrino. He ended the call. Within 30 minutes, the loyal captains of the family were coming through the basement door one at a time. 8 alphas, Lorenzo, Enzo, 2 others from the old days, for younger ones who had proved themselves in the tunnel that morning. They stood in a rough half-circle around the wooden desk. Luca did not sit down. Damien Ricci and Matteo Cani have taken a young Omega named Matteo Rossi from his apartment this afternoon. He saved my life 6 days ago. He is not blood. He is not married into the family. But as of this hour, he is family. You find him in 24 hours. Any alpha who keeps his mouth shut loses his seat. Any alpha who brings me Damien alive gets his seat doubled. Any alpha who harms him dies. Are we clear? 8 voices answered as one. Marco stepped forward. Padrino, you cannot go into the field yourself. You are the target. Luca turned to look at him. Marco, if my father were still alive and the person he owed his life to had been taken because of him, would he stay home tonight? Marco was quiet for a long moment. Then he lowered his head slightly. No, never. Then do not ask me to do what he would not do. Marco said nothing more. He turned to the men and began giving orders. Phones tapped. Street sources woken up. City camera feeds pulled through. Police contacts who owed old favors. Every border crossing watched. 100,000 euros offered for one clean piece of information. By nightfall, half the underworld of the region was looking for a silver car and an Omega with dark braided hair. Luca took a helicopter to Amalfi. The house on the cliff was quiet when he came through the gate. Rosa was in the kitchen with a cup of tea, her hands finally still. Enzo was sitting on the low couch by the window, his feet not touching the floor, the silver butterfly at his throat. He looked up when Luca walked in. Senior Luca. Luca knelt down in front of him so that he did not look tall. Enzo reached into the small pocket of his cardigan and drew out a slim blue vial. He held it out to Luca with both hands. Matteo always carries a spare one for me. Please give it to him when you find him. He might be scared. The medicine helps him not be scared. Luca took the vial from his hands the way another alpha might have taken a saint's relic. He held it in both palms. I will, he said. He kissed the top of Enzo's head softly and stood. He put the blue vial in his breast pocket, right next to his father's pistol. One to end the alphas who took him, one to keep him alive when he brought him back. Matteo Rossi came back to himself the way a body comes back after being held underwater. The first thing he felt was the rope around his wrists, thin nylon cutting into the skin. The second was the ache in his jaw where the alpha in his apartment had struck him. The third was cold, a deep, damp cold that smelled of old paper and rust. He opened his eyes. He was tied to a metal chair in a wide, empty basement. Concrete floor, concrete walls. A single bulb on a wire hanging above him throwing more shadow than light. Somewhere above his head, he could hear a slow drip of water. Somewhere farther away, the wind moved through a broken window and made a low, thin sound like a tired instrument. An abandoned paper mill. He had heard those 2 words on the recording 6 days ago, sitting in the basement of the penthouse. He remembered the smell of paper. His father had come home with it every night when he was small. This was the same smell, older and colder. A door opened at the far end of the room. Matteo Cani walked in. The linen shirts were gone. His makeup was smeared under his eyes. His hair, always so carefully pinned, hung loose on one side. He still wore the pearl cufflinks, and he still wore the gold band. But they no longer looked like jewelry. They looked like items someone had forgotten to remove from a corpse. He stopped 3 steps from Matteo Rossi. Do you know what you are? He said. His voice was steady, but his breathing was not. You are a maid. A little Omega who scrubs floors. And you have destroyed everything I built in 5 years. Matteo Rossi did not answer for a long moment. Then he lifted his eyes. You did not build anything, he said quietly. You only stood beside an alpha who was building. That is why you are angry. Matteo Cani crossed the distance in 2 steps and struck him across the face. Matteo Rossi's head snapped to the side. He did not cry out. He turned his face slowly back and looked at Matteo Cani again with the same steady eyes. Damien came in behind them. Enough, he said. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. You do not need to hit him. He is a tool. Let us use him. He took a phone out of his coat and dialed. It rang once. Padrino. Damien said. 30 million euros. A Cayman account. I will send you the number. 2 hours. No police. No captains. If not, Your new Omega comes back to you piece by piece. Luca's voice came through the phone very quietly. Matteo Rossi heard him even from where he sat. Listen carefully. I do not have 30 million in cash in 2 hours. Give me 12. 6. 8. And I want to hear his voice. Damien paused, considered, then walked to Matteo Rossi and held the phone close to his mouth. Matteo Rossi did not cry. Senior Luca. Enzo, is he safe? Luca's voice was very low. He is safe. He sent something for you. There was the smallest pause, then softer still. The stone step. Do you remember? Matteo Rossi understood. He was coming. He would come. I remember, he said. I remember every day. Damien pulled the phone back and ended the call before Luca could say another word. Matteo Conti stared at Matteo Rossi's face for a long, silent moment. Then, slowly, deliberately, he pulled the gold band from his finger, held it up in the weak light, and threw it onto the concrete at Matteo Rossi's feet. You want it? Take it. It never meant anything real. The ring rolled once and stopped against the leg of the chair. Matteo Rossi looked down at it. He thought about Enzo sitting on a low couch in a house on a cliff, feet not touching the floor, holding out a small blue vial with both hands. He was not afraid of dying. He was afraid of Enzo living without him. Somewhere in the city, Luca Conti had 6 hours to become the alpha his father had warned him he might one day need to be. 6 hours. Luca did not have 30 million euros in cash. He would not have paid it if he had. He knew Damien well enough to know that a witness was never released. Matteo Rossi would be killed with the money in the account or without it. The only difference was how many hours he had. In the basement office, Marco sat over a laptop with a pin behind one ear. He is using a satellite phone, Marco said. You cannot trace those the way you trace a normal line. But 2 years ago, while he was still consigliere, I put a soft GPS marker inside the software of that particular phone. He does not know. He was too proud of himself even then to check. Luca said nothing. The problem, Marco went on, is that the marker only wakes up when he powers the phone fully on. The call he just made to us was the first time in 3 days. I have his coordinates within a range. He turned the laptop around. A red circle sat over an area of the map to the north of the city, an old industrial belt beside the river, 3 kilometers. Inside the circle, there were 4 abandoned buildings. If we hit all 4 at once, he hears the sirens across the district and Matteo dies before we open the first door. Luca looked at the circle for a long time. Then he picked up the satellite phone and dialed the villa in Amalfi. Marco raised an eyebrow. Luca did not explain. Rosa answered. Luca asked gently if Enzo was still awake. He heard the sound of a small barefoot run across the tile floor, then Enzo's voice. Senior Luca. Enzo, I need you to think for me. When your Omega came home in the last few days, did he talk about a place? A place a bad alpha mentioned in the recording? There was a long silence. Luca could picture the small face, pinching in concentration. Matteo said. Enzo began carefully. Matteo said the bad alpha Damien talked about a big chimney. He said he thought it was a paper place, because our papa used to work at a paper place when I was little. He said he remembered the smell of paper. Luca closed his eyes for a moment. Thank you, Enzo. Sleep now. You will bring him tonight. I will bring him tonight. He set the phone down and looked at Marco. Marco was already typing. 3 of the 4 buildings are storage warehouses. One was a paper mill. 40-meter chimney. Closed for 11 years. Owned by a shell company that collapsed 6 months ago. Luca placed a hand on the old alpha's shoulder. Thank you, old friend. Thank Enzo, Marco said. He is smarter than the 3 of us. Within 1 hour, Lorenzo had the raid built. 20 of his best alphas, 3 armored vehicles, 2 silent drones for overhead eyes, body armor under every coat. Luca would lead the entry team down through the paper mill side stairs, straight into the basement, straight to Matteo Rossi. As the men checked their weapons in the courtyard, Marco walked with Luca back through the corridor and stopped him just before the door. Padrino. His voice was very low. He is only a maid. Luca looked at him for a long moment. 6 days ago, he said, I thought that too. I do not think that anymore. And I do not owe an explanation to any alpha in this house. Not even you. Marco held his eyes. Then he nodded once. Then go. Luca walked out through the front door of the penthouse and down the stone steps. It was the same set of stone steps an Omega had pulled him behind 6 mornings ago. The same steps where he had put his hand on Luca's sleeve and told him to be quiet and follow him. He did not adjust the silver watch on his wrist this time. He reached inside his coat and checked the pistol. 6 days ago, he had walked out of that door as a boss. Tonight, he walked out as an alpha with something to lose. 10:30 at night. No moon over the river. The old paper mill stood against the dark sky like a broken tooth, its 40-meter chimney pointing at nothing. The raid teams came in from 3 sides. Lorenzo and 8 alphas through the main gate. 6 more through the loading dock at the back. Luca and 3 of Lorenzo's best down the narrow side stair on the east wall, straight toward the basement. Damien had 8 alphas inside, placed across the ground floor, at the main door, and on the roof. Matteo Rossi sat below all of it in the basement, with Matteo Conti watching over him. Lorenzo's first shot cracked against a steel column at 11 minutes past 10, and the mill filled with sound. The ground floor became a storm. Muzzle flashes stuttered between the old iron pillars, off the sides of rusted drums, along the dead chain of a paper line that had not moved in a decade. Concrete chips flew. Alphas shouted names, positions, warnings in 3 different dialects. Luca did not stop for any of it. He went down. The side stair was tight, wet black. His 3 men followed close, weapons up. The gunfire above became a muffled thunder, then a distant heartbeat. In the basement, Matteo Conti heard it too. He stood up from the wooden crate he had been sitting on, drew a small pistol from the inner pocket of his coat, and walked to Matteo Rossi's chair. He pressed the barrel gently against Matteo Rossi's temple. If he comes down here, Matteo Conti said, you die first. Matteo Rossi turned his head slightly so that he could see Matteo Conti's face. You will not. You do not know me. You have never killed anyone with your own hands. Damien always did that part for you. Matteo Conti's hand shook a single degree. It was enough. Matteo Rossi saw it and looked away, not to gloat, but to spare him. The door at the far end of the basement opened. Luca stepped through it with his pistol raised. 5 meters between them. 2 pistols pointed across the room. Matteo. Luca's voice was quiet, the way water is quiet before it freezes. Put the gun down. Walk out. I will hand you to the police alive. You are lying. You will kill me the moment I lower it. Behind Luca, a second door opened. Damien stepped out from a corridor Luca had not seen, pistol in hand, and moved to a position behind him. He did not know that Marco, moving silently along the outer wall, had already come in behind him through the same corridor a heartbeat later. Damien did not turn. Put the gun down, Padrino, Damien said almost gently. Or I shoot you first. And then him. Luca did not look behind him. He kept his eyes on Matteo Conti. Put it down, Matteo. You still have a way out. Matteo Conti's arm lowered. Only slightly, enough to say maybe. No. Damien snapped. Matteo, shoot him. Shoot. Marco's voice came from the corridor behind him, low and old and completely calm. Damien. Weapon down. Now. Damien flinched, twisted at the waist, brought his pistol around toward the voice. Marco fired first. The sound was flat in the enclosed space. The bullet struck Damien in the right shoulder. Damien's pistol dropped. Damien went down onto one knee, then onto the concrete floor. In the same second, Matteo Conti pulled his trigger. Matteo Rossi was already moving. He threw his weight sideways in the chair. The chair went over. The bullet meant for his temple tore through the meat of his right shoulder instead of his skull. He hit the floor hard. He did not scream. Luca's shot came half a heartbeat later. It caught Matteo Conti high in the thigh. He collapsed against the wall with a small, surprised gasp, sliding down until he was sitting. Luca was already crossing the room. He knelt beside Matteo Rossi, drew a knife, cut the ropes from his wrists. Blood was coming through the shoulder of his coat, dark against the pale gray fabric. His face was very white. Luca gathered him against his chest. Stay with me. Enzo is waiting. Matteo Rossi's lips moved. I thought about him. All of it. All the time. Luca reached into his breast pocket and drew out the small blue vial. He pressed it into Matteo Rossi's uninjured hand and folded his fingers around it. He sent this for you. He said you would need it when you were afraid. But Luca had not yet finished what needed to be finished. Above them, in the dark of the mill, one of them was still trying to run. Marco moved forward, medical kit already in his hand. He pressed a folded pad hard against Matteo Rossi's shoulder, wrapped it tight, and lifted his eyes to Matteo Rossi's with 2 fingers. Look at me, child. Stay awake. You will not sleep tonight. Matteo Rossi nodded weakly. Marco jerked his chin at Damien on the floor. 2 of Lorenzo's men lifted the wounded Alpha by the arms. He would not be killed here. He would be brought back. He would sit in front of the loyal captains of the Connie family, and he would be asked one by one about every Alpha he had bought and every promise he had broken. What happened after that would be older than any court in Italy. Luca turned his head toward the small side stair that led up. Matteo Connie was gone. The wall where he had slid down was empty. A smear of blood traced along the concrete and disappeared toward the corridor he had come from. Even wounded, he had crawled. Even wounded, he had chosen the stair. Luca rose. He did not run. He walked to the stair and started up. He had gone all the way to the roof. Luca came through the small metal door, and the wind hit him at once, strong up there, straight off the river, colder than it had any right to be for the season. The moon was still not out. The chimney rose behind him against a sky the color of wet ash. Matteo Conti stood near the far edge of the roof. His weight was on one leg. His thigh was dark with blood. In his right hand, he held a small pistol. He had picked it up from Damien's fallen weapon before he had dragged himself up the stairs. He lifted it when he saw Luca. Do not come closer. I will shoot. Luca stopped 10 meters short. Matteo, it is enough. Matteo laughed, cracked and old and very tired. Enough? Do you know what enough is, Luca? I am enough. I have been enough for 5 years. The wind pulled at his hair. He kept the pistol up. I loved you once. Really. When you were 31 and you had nothing but your father's name. I stayed while you built. I planned your dinners. I smiled for your photographs. I closed my eyes when you came home with blood on your shirt. I made myself into what you needed. He swallowed once. His voice did not soften. And every year, you told me, next year we marry. Every year I aged. Every year Damien saw me. Every year you did not. He laughed again, shorter this time. You gave me houses. I wanted a name. You gave me diamonds. I wanted a seat. I did not become this in one day, Luca. You built me into this day by day for 5 years. Luca did not raise his weapon. He did not argue. He knew that part of what Matteo said was true, and he was too old to lie to a man on the edge of a roof. If you shoot, Luca said quietly, you die tonight. If you do not shoot, you go to a cell. Either way, you lose. But if you lower the gun, I will make sure Enzo never knows that anyone almost like you existed in this story. Matteo held very still. Then he laughed, dry and small. Enzo, what does that child have that every alpha in this city wants to protect? He pulled the trigger. The shot went wide. The bullet passed over Luca's shoulder and disappeared into the wind above the river. Luca did not have time to raise his own pistol. From the small door behind him, a single shot answered. Marco Vitali stood in the doorway, his weapon still raised. The bullet struck Matteo Conti high in the chest. He staggered back 1 step. He looked at Luca one last time, and there was for a fraction of a second something almost young in his face. Then his balance failed him, and he went over the edge of the roof. The gold band, which he had picked up from the basement floor and clenched in his free hand, slipped from his fingers a heartbeat before he fell. It rolled once across the rooftop gravel and stopped. Luca walked to it slowly. He picked it up. He looked at it in the weak city light. He walked to the corner where the old rain gutter ran down into the darkness. He dropped the ring into it. He walked down from the roof lighter than he had walked up. Not because he had won, but because he had ended something that had been ending for years without either of them admitting it. The private clinic of the family sat on a quiet street on the outskirts of the city. No sign at the gate, no name on the door. It had operated on Luca's father twice, on Marco once, and on a dozen other alphas who preferred that certain wounds did not appear in police files. The bullet in Matteo Rossi's shoulder had passed cleanly through the muscle and out the back. It had missed the artery by a finger. The surgeons repaired the tear, closed the skin, and told Luca he would sleep for at least 12 hours. He slept for 14. Luca did not leave the room once. He drank cold coffee. He read the medical chart 4 times. He washed Matteo Rossi's face, and the small blue vial from Enzo's cardigan sat on the bedside table where Luca had placed it the moment they had brought him in. When Matteo Rossi's eyes finally opened, the first thing he saw was Luca Conti sitting in a plain chair by the window, reading a hospital form and holding a pen he had not used. Luca looked up. Enzo arrives in 20 minutes. Matteo Rossi did not answer. His mouth opened and closed and opened again. And then, for the first time in the whole of the last week, he began to cry. Not because of the pain in his shoulder, not because of the memory of the concrete basement, but because now, at last, he was allowed to. Luca did not move to him. He sat where he was. He gave him the room and the silence in which to weep. There are certain kinds of grace that do not involve touch. 20 minutes later, the door opened. Rosa came in first, and Enzo slipped past Rosa's skirt and ran across the tile floor. Matteo Rossi lifted his one good arm from the bed. Enzo climbed up beside him, careful of the bandages the way a child is careful of the ribbon on a doll. He pressed his small face into his Omega's neck. "I am sorry," Matteo Rossi whispered into his hair. "I am so sorry." Enzo shook his head against Matteo Rossi's skin, his voice small and firm. "Signor Luca said you saved him. He said you were a hero." Matteo Rossi looked over the top of Enzo's head at the alpha by the window. "No, little one. He saved me." From the chair, Luca spoke quietly and only once. "All 3 of us saved each other." 3 weeks passed. The city outside the penthouse settled into the low, quiet hum a city makes when a large fight has ended and no one has yet decided whether to speak of it. The consiglio met. Damian Ricci did not walk out of the room. The family closed around itself the way a wound closes and slowly began to heal. On the 4th week, an aircraft belonging to the family landed at Zurich. Dr. Weiss was the best pediatric heart surgeon in Europe, patient, quiet, expensive. On a Tuesday morning, he opened Enzo's small chest, sewed a patch across the hole between the 2 chambers of his heart, and closed him again. Luca and Matteo Rossi sat in the waiting room. Luca made him coffee from the little machine in the corner. Matteo wore a soft gray sweater over his sling. He watched Luca steadily. "Why are you doing this?" Matteo asked. "You do not have to." "I do." "No. I mean, you do not owe me." Luca looked out the window. The first snow of the season had begun to fall over Zurich, small and slow. "Matteo, in my life, there have been 2 people who did the right thing for me when they had nothing to gain from it, my father and you. My father died for doing the right thing. I am not going to let that happen to you." Matteo was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Rosa says my father used to say, when someone gives you something you did not beg for, that is not a debt. That is a gift. You take it, and one day you give it back, not to that person, but to another person who needs it." Luca looked at him. "Then we do not owe each other. We do not owe each other." An hour later, Dr. Weiss came through the double doors with tired eyes and a small, clean smile. The surgery was successful. Enzo would live a full life. He would run. He would grow. He would be a healthy child. Matteo turned toward Luca, and without thinking put his one good arm around him. It was the first time he had held him. It was short. Neither of them knew what to say afterward. They walked out of the hospital into snow. Neither of them had planned to see. And for the first time in a very long time, Luca Conti did not check his watch. 2 months later, the penthouse had learned to breathe again. The corridors were quieter than before, but not empty. The staff had come back to work. The morning sun still crossed the marble floors at the same angle it had crossed them for 100 years. Only the west wing had changed. The doors of Matteo Conti's old rooms had been closed and locked, and no one asked when they would be opened again. Enzo had begun to run. He ran everywhere, down the stone corridor, across the courtyard, around the fountain 3 times before breakfast, until Rosa had to sit down on the low bench beside the roses to catch her own breath. Enzo's cheeks were no longer pale. Dr. Weiss had sent a letter the previous week saying that his heart was healing more beautifully than he had dared to hope. That morning, he was in the garden, chasing a small blue butterfly across the grass. His laughter carried across the courtyard the way small bells carry through a chapel. Rosa sat on a stone bench near the roses with a bundle of soft yarn on her lap, knitting a scarf that would probably outlive her. Luca and Matteo walked slowly down the same stone path that Matteo, Connie, and Damien had once walked. The rose bushes on either side were in full bloom. Matteo wore a plain white shirt. His right arm was out of the sling now, though he still moved it carefully. They walked for a while without speaking. Then Matteo stopped. "I think I should go back to work," he said. "Not here. I cannot stay a maid in your house anymore. It would be strange." Luca stopped beside him. "You will not be a maid anywhere. Not for anyone." Matteo turned to look at him. "Then what do I do? I cannot only receive." Luca looked toward the far end of the garden, where a small white butterfly rose and fell over the grass, and thought for a long moment. "There is a foundation my father started 30 years ago. It funds heart surgery for children whose families cannot pay. It has been badly run for a decade. No one has really taken care of it. Would you like to run it?" Matteo stared at him. "Me? I never went to university." "Neither did I. But I run a family." "You ran a household of 2 on 3 minimum wage jobs for 5 years. You saved my life with a phone held together by tape. You have enough." Matteo was quiet for a moment. Then he asked something Luca had not expected. "Are you afraid? After everything?" Luca looked out toward the roses. "Yes, but not the way I used to be. I used to be afraid of losing power. Now I am afraid of something much smaller." "What?" Luca waited. Then he said, "That one day, when Enzo is fully well, and you have money of your own, and you no longer need me, you will leave." Matteo looked at his feet. Then he looked up. "Signor Luca, I did not stay because I needed you. If I stay, it will be because I want to." Luca did not say anything. He simply set his hand over Matteo's as they stood on the stone path. He did not press. He did not hold. He just placed it there and left it there. And neither of them moved. "Signor Luca? Matteo, come and see the butterfly. It is blue." Luca drew his hand back from Matteo's just before Enzo looked up. But Matteo smiled softly, and he began to walk toward his brother with Luca beside him. There would be time for words later. Right now, there was only a blue butterfly and 3 people who had almost never had the chance to see it.